Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The 2020 general election was historic for many reasons, not the least of which was voter turnout. Over 70% of California's eligible voters voted, the highest turnout since the general election of 1952, and that was in the midst of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. Our guest is Mindy Romero. She's the director of USC's Center for Inclusive Democracy, and she's written that, quote, the method in which Californians decided to cast their ballot was equally remarkable, with notable changes in voting behavior and patterns that could continue in future elections. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me again. It's good to see you.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Voter Choice Act. A lot of people attribute these voter changes to that. Can you give a brief synopsis of the Voter Choice Act?
Sure. Pretty simple. It's a new model that if you adopt it, if a county chooses to adopt it, they have to adopt all the elements. They can't pick and choose. Every registered voter in that county gets automatically mailed a vote-by-mail ballot. There's a change from traditional neighborhood polling places to what we call vote centers, which are less numerous, but you can go and vote at any vote center in your county as opposed to being assigned a local polling place. You can vote up to 11 days or 10 days before the election and election day. Drop boxes are required, and they're numerous throughout the county. And you have additional services that are available to you if you are voting.
It just made voting a lot more convenient for a lot of folks. And it seems
provides more options and an earlier, longer time frame to be able to vote more ways, more days, as they like.
And what you found is a lot of people were voting by mail. I'm just wondering, why do they vote by mail? Do you attribute that to the Voter Choice Act, the pandemic, or just voters are changing the way they vote?
Yeah, I think it's too early to attribute anything to the Voter Choice Act because for most counties in 2020, it was the first time they were adopting it. Really, probably more than anything else, the pandemic, as it changed so many aspects of our lives. And we know from previous research that we've done, survey research, that voters were concerned about safety and voting in person. They had more options that were available to them statewide, whether they were a Voters Choice Act county or not, because of the pandemic that legally that were prescribed to them. So I think people had more options, and they were also motivated to vote in different ways because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm wondering, what about demographics? Are there certain groups that prefer to vote in person versus vote by mail, or the opposite? Want to vote by mail as opposed to vote in person?
Yeah, we saw differences in 2020, and actually they were pretty consistent with differences that we've seen over really the last 20 years in California. What changed was just more people used vote by mail or used a vote by mail ballot in some way. So we know historically Latinos, young voters, new voters tend to prefer, at least in percentages, voting in person versus vote by mail. In 2020, still overwhelmingly, Latinos and young people and new voters used vote by mail. There's a difference geographically, there's a difference by party.
Let me ask you, I actually want to follow up on the one by party. That's I find really interesting. So political affiliation, was there a difference in vote in person versus vote by mail by party affiliation?
Yeah. So everyone in 2020 that cast a ballot, of all those voters, just under 13% actually voted in person. But if you break it up by party, it was 9% of all Democratic votes. Again, how people are registered, not necessarily how they actually voted. Right. And about 18% of all Republican votes were in person.
Wow, that's pretty stark. Well, where do the independents fall? Were they more likely to vote by mail or in person?
They're kind of in the middle, as they often are.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what seems to me, it seems to me that that's almost like a sea change, though. My understanding was, and you're the expert, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that Republicans are the ones who traditionally voted by mail. And now you're seeing that that's not the case. It's the Democrats who are voting by mail. I'm just wondering, can we refer to that as the Trump effect?
Well, a lot of people are. I would say that is a one big change. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of patterns have stayed the same. Just everybody, more people are voting by mail. So by race, ethnicity, age, But party was the big kind of switch, right? Dramatically so. And you're absolutely right. Republicans were favoring vote by mail previously, historically more. There was a systematic kind of attack against voting by mail, not only by the president at the time, but also by many others. And there's still a campaign of misinformation. We saw it in the recall election here in California just last month and leading up to it. So yeah, there's a lot of concern, misinformation, fear that voters have, and it is skewed more for Republicans, as we know, not just for how they're actually voting, but we see a lot of survey evidence that tells us that they lack a confidence in round vote by mail.
Well, up next, we're going to take a look at that issue of secure and accuracy of mail-in ballots. What will the increase in mail-in ballots, longer voting periods, and changing electorate mean for future elections? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Mindy Romero from USC's Center for Inclusive Democracy about how the 2020 election changed how people voted and what that may mean for future elections. Mindy, we've all heard about the allegations about security and accuracy of mail-in ballots. What is the percentage of mail-in ballots that are rejected, and what are the main reasons they're rejected?
Yeah, well, in any election, there's a certain percentage. It varies. In 2020, in the general election, it was just 0.5%, half a percent. But that still equated to over 80,000 vote by mail ballots that were rejected because we had such a high turnout.
So yeah, so it's a very small proportion of the number of vote-in ballots that were cast. But what were the main reasons? Is it signatures, either not on the ballots, or they don't match what they have at the registrar's office? What?
Yeah, well, this last November, the main reason was signature issues, either not having a signature, forgetting to sign your ballot envelope, or having what we call a bad signature, a signature that's not matching, because every vote by mail ballot does have to be signature verified. As part of the security protocols. And then the other reason is being late. Now, typically until November, the top three reasons are those two signature issues, and the top reason is always late. That's first. It can vary a little bit by subgroup. We saw a big change in November that number one reason wasn't being late. And we think that that was because the state gave a 17-day window for vote by mail ballots, as long as they were postmarked by election day, to actually get to your local office. And so late ballots went way down.
So what about demographics? Do they factor into rejection rates?
They do. And again, they did in November, and they also have historically. So we know that Latinos, new voters, young voters, age 18 to 24, in any given election, including November, have higher rejection rates. Are more likely to get their vote by mail ballot rejected. And there's also differences by county, by party, by other statuses as well. But race, ethnicity, and age are the kind of big ones that we always see.
So overall, I mean, we're talking about what does it tell us? What does your study tell us about the overall voting experience?
In terms of just understanding that there was this big shift, right? So first off, we saw not only vote by mail use go up, but only a third of all actual ballots were actually sent through the mail in November. People chose lots of different ways. As we said earlier, almost 40% dropped them off. Another 16% dropped them off at a voting location. 40% dropped them off at a
Don't trust the mail.
People had concerns about the mail. People also really wanted, some voters just have no concerns at all. Some voters want to actually see it go in a box. If they're not doing it the old fashioned way and voting in person, they still want to see it go in a drop box. And sometimes it really matters for them if it's actually a physical location that is staffed, because they want to know somebody's there and they don't trust a drop box. So how people voted changed. We know there was a party designation certainly too, but we also did a representative survey of voters statewide coming out of November. And we still heard that a lot of voters didn't know about all of their options, even though their voting behavior may have changed. They didn't know about or weren't aware of all of the different options that they could have used potentially. and that there's this huge need for outreach and voter education,
Yeah, I
particularly.
wanted to follow up on that in terms of voter education. I mean, do your findings show that we really need more voter education?
Yeah, I mean, this is a no-brainer because we know in every election there's always a large segment of the electorate that isn't fully aware of not just their options of how they can vote, but they're not aware of all the messages that are out there, that they're still kind of information low, and this can impact not only how they vote, where they vote, but even if they vote. And in 2020, despite all of, and there was a lot of resources, a lot of money that was spent just educating people about the pandemic change and these new options that were available to them. And then, of course, the counties that adopted the Voters' Choice Act for the first time put in a lot of effort and a lot of partnership with local groups to get the word out. It's not that any of that wasn't effective. I think all of it, was tremendous good work, but the hill to climb, the mountain to climb is just that large. And we know that voters, many did not know all of their options. They weren't as comfortable with all of their options. And it's, going forward, we can't assume that, everybody was educated in 2020 and we're going to basically be good to go in future elections. No, we still have a lot of information that still has to get out there to voters.
Yeah, but it's great to know that we are, yeah, we are seeing, we did see at least last time, record turnout, which is tremendous. That's what you want in a democracy. And it kind of goes with, right, and it goes with the title of your organization, the Center for Inclusive Democracy. I want to thank Mindy Romero from the center for joining us. Up next, we're going to take a look at California's likely voters. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So who are California's likely voters? Recently, the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California took a look, and Dean Bonner with the PPIC is here to tell us about their results. Welcome to the Maddy Report, Dean.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you back. So how many registered voters are there in California, and what percent of those eligible voters, those eligible to vote, are registered?
Sure enough, today, as of the most recent report of registration, which was 15 days prior to the September recall, there are 22.1 million registered voters. And this makes up about 9 in 10 of eligible voters in California, which there are about 24.8 million registered voters. But when you kind of zoom out a little bit, we're actually about 75% of all adults in California are represented by registered voters.
Those seems like pretty good numbers.
Yeah, we've actually, have seen some improvement in recent years.
Yeah, I want
where,
to ask you about that historically. How does that kind of match up? How do the numbers match up historically?
Sure enough, I think, as you know, California has been doing a lot of things to encourage people to register to vote and to increase voter registration. So if we just look back 4 years, we actually see that just 78% of eligible adults were registered, and that's an 11-point increase. If we go all the way back to 2003, that was 70% were registered, and that's a 19-point increase. We have, online voter registration, as well as Motor Voter 2.0, which allows folks to register or update their registration with interactions at the DMV.
Yeah, it seems like, being at the DMV and it's a one-stop shop and getting everything done, that seems to be pretty helpful, pretty convenient.
Seems like it, that is, as far as younger folks also like the online registration, as well as the pre-registration of those who are 16 and older, which
Yeah.
is an important part of it too.
Yeah, we tell them how important it is to vote, but we got to make it really convenient. But it is what it is, and so we understand that. You report that the likely voters lean Democratic, but are ideologically mixed. What do you mean by that?
Sure enough. So among our likely voters, who are the people we deem, first of all, who are registered and who we deem most likely to vote, we find that, about 48% say that they're registered as Democrats. About 1 in 4 say they're registered as Republican, and just over 1 in 5 say they're registered as independent. However, when we look at political ideology, and how they kind of identify, we find that just 40% identify as liberal, but 29% identify as moderate, and 31% identify as conservative. So obviously there are some Democrats who don't consider themselves necessarily liberal, and some conservatives who don't necessarily consider themselves as registered Republicans.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Pew Research Center just sent out kind of this thing where you can check, you can ask, they ask you several questions, and they're like 6 different categories and on a sliding scale from very conservative, very liberal. You kind of figure out where you are. So that's been on, the Maddy Institute publications, but you can go check the Pew Research Center if you want to find out where you stand or where you lie, wherever it is on the political spectrum. I want to ask you about independent voters. Those are either not registered with a political party, no NPP, no party preference, or not registered at all. I'm just wondering, do they lean one way or the other?
In our surveys, when we identify independent likely voters, so these are folks who are registered to vote, but registered as NPP folks.
Mm-hmm.
And in California, they do tend to lean towards the Democratic Party. And this in recent years has made California become slightly more blue, because of the fact that just over half of independent likely voters lean towards the Democratic Party. Just over a third lean towards the Republican Party. And so that's really important when you start breaking down the kind of, the politics of the state. Having half of independents lean towards the Democratic Party obviously makes a big difference when it comes to elections.
Yeah, not quite independent, of course, they're kind of leaning Democratic. But I thought that the number, at least for a period of time there, NPP, the percentage was actually higher than the number of Republicans that were registered.
It was higher there for a little bit. It's kind of tracked downward. There's some kind of belief that, and there was a whole expose by the LA Times, which looked at some folks who thought they were registered as independent,
right?
Were actually registered as the American Independent Party,
right.
As well as the fact that when people automatically registered through the DMV, they get sent something, they're registered as NPP, and then they have to change it. And so some of that could have been some kind of back-end mechanism. But right now, they're pretty even, Republicans and independents in party registration.
Yeah, it's interesting. The American Independent Party is actually a very conservative party, and people didn't realize that. They thought they were registering as independents. NPP is if you want to be an independent. Last question I want to ask you. We've only got about 30, 45 seconds left in this segment. But what can you tell us about the demographics of California's likely voters?
I mean, I think the best way to talk about the demographics of the likely voters in California is to look at what we like to call the exclusive electorate in California. And the fact that likely voters and those who show up at the polls look different than the overall adult population of California. They tend to be older, they tend to be more educated, they tend to be more affluent, homeowners, and US born. They also tend to be more likely white than the share of their population overall. And among unregistered folks, we find that 6 in 10 are Latinos, despite the fact that just 35% of the adult population are Latinos. And so there's some misrepresentation there. And so when folks go to the ballot box to make policy, the likely voters don't necessarily reflect all California.
Right. Yeah. Some groups are punching above their weight, some punching below their weight, I guess you'd say. Up next, we're going to take a look at California voters and party profiles. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Dean Bonner with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California about California voters and party profiles. I want to ask you kind of to follow up on current California voter breakdown. Let's talk about that again between Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and how have those numbers changed over time? Like we were talking about, NPP, independent voters used to be above Republicans. Now they're not. I mean, how have those numbers changed over time?
Sure enough, so today, as the most recent report, the share of the registered voters are 46.5% Democrat, 24.1% Republican, and 23.3% independent or NPP voters. And so Republicans and independents are quite similar now. And if we look back just 4 years, the results are fairly similar, within a point or two here and there. But if we go back to 2003, before the last recall, that's where you'll see a lot of movement. The share who are Republicans are actually down 11 points. The share who are no party preference is actually up 7 points. And the share who are Democratic are up 3 points. So there has been some shifts if you go back to the recall in 2003.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. First of all, to note that you were talking 24% are registered Republicans, 46% registered Democrats. So if you're wondering, why the Democrats control 2/3 of the legislature, they have twice as many on a percentage basis registered voters. That's one clue. The second thing I'm wondering is, you would think that President Trump, ex-President Trump, has energized a lot of people in the Republican base. You would think that they would have more registered voters, but the data doesn't seem to support that.
Well, some of that we think has to do with, there are folks who tend to be conservative, but maybe not espouse some of the same views as the former president, or maybe they were just turned off by the way his kind of style, let's say. And so that led to some folks in the Republican Party, leaving the party. But as I said, it's not that different. It's just shy of 2 points down since 2017.
And it may have, and President Trump may not only have motivated people to register as Republicans, but also to register as Democrats. And then other than this NPP, the independents, some people who may like maybe the substance, but not the style, they become independents. So that is also kind of gain some traction. And about those independents, you were talking earlier, they're not totally independent, are they?
No, it's the myth of the independent voter, and this topic has been debated in political science circles for years. And today, we see that just 12% are saying that they lean towards neither party. And given this hyperpartisanship in recent years, we've actually seen a change. Since 2007, we've seen a 9-point increase in the share leaning towards the Democratic Party, where it's now at 52%. And we've seen a 7-point increase in the share identifying as Republican, which is currently at 36%. And there are just 12% of independents who actually say they lean towards neither party at this point in time.
And that's actually gone down. It seems we are becoming more polarized, right?
That's just where we are as far as the country, it seems like, and the state just kind of mirrors that.
Right. I want to ask you about this. You noted earlier that likely voters are disproportionately white, and you report that likely Democratic voters are more diverse and have many demographic traits of likely voters across that differ across parties. I mean, what do you mean? What are the details here in terms of Democratic, Republican, independents versus where white voters are, Latino voters are, Asian Americans, African Americans, things like that?
Sure enough. Well, the Democratic Party has often been referred to as a big tent party, right? There are bunches of different types of folks and coalitions who kind of coalesce under the Democratic Party. And so that leads to different types of folks. And so, if we just look at race, for example, fewer than half of Democratic likely voters in our survey are white at 46%. While for the Republican Party, 69% of Republican likely voters in our survey are white, and about half of independent likely voters are white. And so that's one big difference. But that's not where it ends. Democrats tend to be much more young. Republicans tend to be older. Democrats are more likely to be women than men, while independents and Republicans are more likely to be Democrats happen to be women more likely than men, and Republican independents more likely to be men than women.
We're running against a hard deadline. I mean, the data is really interesting. The other thing I would mention is, difference between, educated and less educated. There's also a split there as well. So a lot of interesting stuff. Encourage people to check out the PPI website for more information. I want to thank Dean Bonner, our guest. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.